Meet Nigel Topping, former CEO of We Mean Business, where he drove collaboration for climate action among NGOs and helped raise the constructive voice of business in support of the Paris Agreement. He's also the former executive director of CDP and a current commissioner of the Energy Transitions Commission, and is currently the UK-appointed high-level climate champion for COP26.
Hello there, Nigel Topping. Great to have you back on our broadcast. We're very ready for your presentation.
Great, thanks, Christina. Thanks, Nick. It's great to be back. And I wanted to talk about this issue of finance and I want to make 4 points really. I want to talk about making sure we're focused on the right goals, making sure we understand the pattern of change, and where we're at on that in different sectors, so we apply the right levers, and then how we mobilize collective action, and finally some specifics about mobilizing private finance. So the first point I want to make is that, and I'm sure Nick will talk more about this, but we know that this is really crucial multilateral goal of mobilizing $100 billion per year by this year, and then increasing it. That's a promise that was made by the developed countries to developing countries. It's a promise that hasn't yet been met. That's a crucial goal. We know that the UK presidency is working really hard on that, and Patricia referred to it. And of course, we're hoping to hear some positive news from the Biden administration today, and I know that they're hoping that others will join them in helping us get to that 100 billion goal. But the first point I want to make is that's not the only goal. That's something that has to be reached. We also have to recognize that in order to halve emissions this decade and to tackle the adaptation and resilience challenges, particularly in the vulnerable countries in the global south, we need trillions of dollars. The World Bank estimates that every year we need $4 trillion of capital in emerging and developing economies to pay for the mitigation and adaptation needs. And remember, most of the new infrastructure in the world, most of the new buildings, most of the new roads and factories will be built in the global south. So the first thing is, let's make sure we are working on the 100 billion and the 4 trillion. The second thing when we're talking about mobilizing finance is we need to recognize this pattern, which Johan has done such a great job of bringing to all our attention, of exponential change. We put that at the heart of the race to zero. We know that every technology-driven industrial transformation follows that pattern of going very slowly and then going exponential and suddenly taking off. Key point is to recognize where we're at in a given sector on that process. Early on in that process, the new technology costs more. So take green hydrogen. It costs a lot more than fossil fuel hydrogen at the moment. So the key there is to accelerate through the innovation process to get the cost down. That needs the kind of instruments of like venture capital, and from the kind of policies like R&D support and early project commissioning from governments. So that early phase of the S-curve of the exponential change requires us to focus on pace, driving down the cost curve quickly. Once we've got to cost competitiveness, then markets start to take off, but they need two things: policy clarity. So Biden administration talking about a net zero grid in America by 2035, the UK banning combustion engine sales in 2030. Those give the policy clarity that allow equity investors and banks to pile in, and also, of course, companies to invest off their own balance sheets. So although the change is exponential, depending on where we're at, whether it's the early stage of emergence and driving down the cost, or the mid stage of rapid diffusion, we require different financial instruments and different policies. The third thing I'd say, and it's great to hear from Ericsson, because this is a lesson we can learn from the mobile industry, is that we have to learn how to go fast together by chunking the future down into generations of change. So we're all used to the idea of 4G, 5G. That's a pre-competitively agreed pathway for change that the whole industry has agreed on. They compete within that, but they don't compete on the pathway. So we need to do the same. That's why Within the Race to Zero, we've defined these interim targets of Race to Zero ambition breakthrough. So we're trying to get to 20% of every sector in the Race to Zero committed to that exponential change as soon as possible. Hopefully we'll get at least 10 of them by Glasgow. Actually, just yesterday, I was talking at the GSMA, that's the global mobile industries conference. They have now reached 36% of the companies by revenue committed to the Race to Zero. So they've passed that tipping point. And then we focus on the real economy tipping point. And again, for an early stage technology like hydrogen, that's about driving the cost down to below $2 a kilo by 2025. And for a mature technology like electric vehicles, that's about ramping up the volume so that by 2025, we're at 15% of sales globally, on track to ending combustion engine sales completely for light vehicles in the early 30s. So focusing on that collaborative action, what's the pathway that we can all agree on? The final point I'd say is, of course, this takes that massive mobilization of private sector finance. Most of the gap between the 100 billion and the 4 trillion will be private sector finance. Yesterday, Mark Carney and I and the COP presidency launched the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero. We're trying to get all the major financial players committed to be on this exponential path. So it was very exciting yesterday. We now got 87 asset managers with, I have to look at my notes, it's so fresh, $37 trillion of assets. That's more than a third of global assets committed to net zero by 2050, and 43 banks with $29 trillion of balance sheet. All of those companies have committed to net zero by 2050, but more importantly, to having a clear plan of what they're going to do as their part of helping us get to 50% reductions by 2030. Now, last point I'd make is, in order for the finance to flow in middle income and less developed economies, we need to pay attention to three further things. We need to make sure in order to have mature green markets that will allow private sector capital to flow, we need to improve the quality of institutional capability. So we need to help build green investment banks around the world, for example. We need to recognize that there are different risk profiles in some of those countries. So we need special instruments like credit risk enhancement instruments to reduce the risk so that private capital will flow, and make sure we're using public finance to reduce that risk. And we need to make sure that plans become investable projects. It's no good a country saying, I've got a plan for this many gigawatts of renewable energy if it isn't broken down into actual investable projects. So those are the four things we need to pay attention to: the 100 billion and the 4 trillion, the right instrument at the early or the later stage of the exponential curve, working together on those pathways to breakthroughs, and mobilizing private finance at scale in the next 10 years. Thank you, Katrina.
Well, thank you very much, Nick, for sharing your passion and your insights. I'm sure the viewers are interested in what your hopes are for the COP. Please tell us.
Well, I would say there's three things going on at the COP. There's the negotiations. So I hope that the negotiations are successful. They're mostly negotiating on the detail of the Paris rulebook, like on how countries report transparently and in what form and on what time frames. So I hope that those are successfully concluded, because that's a proof point of the multilateral system. Much more optimistic about that now that America is coming back into the Paris Agreement, setting a positive tone of multilateralism. Second of all, we must see countries step up and meet the commitment from Paris to ratchet their plans every 5 years. That's happening today, partly at the Biden summit. We're expecting to hear, I don't know, I think it's already out on the news, like a 50% plus by 2030 commitment from the USA, a 46 to 50% commitment. That's a big enhancement from Japan, and we hope to hear more today. And then third, and included in that package is the finance that Patricia talked about, the 100 billion. And then there's the mobilization of the real economy. Can we see that this is the COP of, which is really a COP of what I would say action and solidarity. So we're not just talking about promises, but what we're doing about them on the ground, and that we're recognizing that mitigation and resilience in the north and the south all have to move, not just part of the puzzle. This is a whole of society, whole of world challenge, and the COP needs to represent that in that focus on action and solidarity.